Start. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We have Wes Larson, my partner, and one of our guides, as well as John Carlson, here to talk to you guys about polar bears. Without further ado, I'm going to let Wes take it away.
Great. So just a little bit about myself, I guess. I am a bear biologist. I'm going to share my screen here. But before I get started, okay, here we go. So I'm not guiding this trip, but I do work with Naturalist Journeys a bit. As Jessie mentioned, she's a full-time employee with them and she's my partner. And then I've gotten into a little bit of guiding with Naturalist Journeys, but I do have a lot of experience with polar bears. I'm a wildlife biologist by trade. I started in polar bears. I've worked a total of 7 field seasons with polar bears over a period of 8 years, published a couple papers, have some good experience with them. So I wanted to run through a little bit of what that experience looked like, just so you guys know that I'm not just some guy talking about polar bears. I worked on a project that specifically looked at how polar bears are interacting with the oil industry and what kind of preventative measures could be taken to protect bears that were in a very vulnerable state near and around oil industry installments. That was in the northern part of Alaska on the Arctic Ocean. It's very flat, very cold, not the most scenic place in the world, not a great place for a trip like the ones that you guys are considering going on, but it does have its special charms. And it is it's a place that's really close to my heart. I was lucky to see the Northern Lights dozens of times while I was up there. Lots of really cool wildlife. Musk oxen were a pretty common sight for us. Fox, red fox, Antarctic fox were up there. This is a red fox that is kind of a cross fox, red fox. Arctic fox were common. And then we were up there to actually look for polar bear dens that might be denning within the oil industry, the oil field. And that's kind of a tricky prospect. It's not an easy thing to do. We use FLIR cameras to do that. We use dog teams to try and find those dens. And if we were lucky, we would have a bear that was radio collared that had denned in the area. The reason they're so hard to find is polar bears will den in just a big snowdrift. They dig into that snowdrift. It snows over top of them. They're completely encapsulated within that den. They don't leave at all during the winter. This is just the pregnant females that are denning, and they're going to spend the entire 3 or 4 months inside of that den, raising their cubs till they're old enough to come out. And so you can't see them with the naked eye. They're really hard to find. In the back of this photo, you can see there's like a tiny bit of topography there. That's some of the only topography in the area, so it's a really common spot for bears to den. Once we found a potential den site, we'd set up these autonomous cameras. And what we were trying to record was some footage like this. This is a bear that had just come out of her den with her newborn cub. This is footage that only we've really collected because the bears don't know that we're there. We have these autonomous cameras. There aren't any human observers. So this is really natural behavior that we were capturing that really is unique to the world. No one else has really been able to capture this kind of footage. And scientifically, it was really important because we could understand what these bears are doing as soon as they leave their dens with their new cubs. And that was kind of a big hole in the science. It also is just really beautiful, compelling footage. It's like something that almost makes me emotional every time I watch it. Anyway, that's what we were collecting. This was a bear that did notice our camera that decided to rip it down immediately when she came out of her den. So this was the last thing that camera recorded, was this full-on shot of this bear. After we took the footage, after we compiled the data, we would also go into the dens once they'd been abandoned. We'd measure them. We'd look for any cubs that didn't make it through the winter. So this is a photo of me inside of a polar bear den. And this is me sticking my head out right where mom had stuck her head out for the first time as well. So it was a really interesting project. I wrote a paper on disturbances at those den sites. And that's kind of how I got started in polar bears. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the general ecology of polar bears, and specifically the ecology in the 2 places where Naturalist Journeys is going to be running trips. So polar bears, their Latin name, their scientific name is Ursus maritimus, which literally means sea bear. And that is because these are technically marine mammals. Polar bears are so tied to the ocean and to the marine ecosystems that they inhabit that they are a sea bear. All of their food comes from the sea. They are a bear that uses sea ice as a platform for hunting. So they are a sea bear. There are 19 subpopulations of polar bears. This map highlights all of them. They're found throughout the circumpolar, Arctic, and subarctic. And we're going to look at the two subpopulations of interest tonight. But this is where they're spread out. Scientists estimate, scientists like myself and other polar bear scientists, that there's roughly 25,000 to 30,000 polar bears throughout the Arctic. That number has gone up since the 70s. And that's when polar bears got formal protection. They used to be hunted pretty extensively. They were being whittled down. The number's gone up, but now they face a very large existential threat, which is, of course, climate change and the loss of their hunting platform. We're going to talk a tiny bit more about that in a second, but they are the largest of all the bears. Grizzly bears can get as large as a polar bear, but on average, polar bears are larger. Males can get up to 1,500, even 1,700 pounds. Females are about half the size, so they're very sexually dimorphic. And as I mentioned before, they are completely tied to the sea ice as a hunting platform for their main meal, which is seals. Where I was studying polar bear, the two seals that they're really looking for are primarily ring seals and then sometimes bearded seals as well. I was also in an area where some of the native communities up there would hunt bowhead whales. And when they pull those whales up on the shore, the polar bears kind of had this extra meal deal of whale carcasses in the fall, which was a big boon for those bears. So here's a bear doing what it does best, finishing off the remains of a seal. This is it always looks very kind of gruesome because they're a white bear. They're eating just meat and they get all this blood on them. But it is kind of an interesting thing to imagine a bear hunting seals out in this pack ice. Okay, so we're going to talk first about Svalbard because I know that's one of the destinations that some people might be interested in visiting. I've personally never been to Svalbard. A number of my colleagues have worked there. I know it's a really amazing place, very visually beautiful. I'm sure John is going to get into some more details there. But the bears that live in Svalbard are part of the Barents Sea subpopulation of polar bears. They are very wild polar bears in that they are completely spending their days out on the pack ice and the sea ice, rarely coming ashore, and pretty much consistently throughout the year looking for ice to hunt seals from. The Barents Sea is home to about 2,500 polar bears, was the most recent estimation. And when you do go on these trips to look for polar bears in Svalbard, this is kind of the scene where you would expect to see them. This interconnected pack ice in the summer where the bears are out looking for seals that might be out on the pack ice. In the summer, because the ice is so disconnected, you're going to get a lot of bears that are actually swimming to try and hunt the seals, sneaking up behind the seals on these chunks of pack ice. And it's not nearly as an effective form of hunting as in the winter when the sea ice is pretty consistent. They'll look for breathing holes and they'll actually just wait by those breathing holes. The seal pops its head up, the bear grabs the seal and pulls it out. Or they'll actually look for seal dens too and cave them in and pull the pups out and eat them. So that's kind of their most effective manner of hunting. But in the summer in the Barents Sea and in Svalbard, you're going to see more of this, these bears that are roving, looking for seals that might not be paying great attention and hunting them in more kind of like a stock hunting. It's really fascinating. It's a beautiful kind of backdrop to see them. You've got this really beautiful blue ice. You've got the rugged coastline of Svalbard in the background. I think as far as kind of a natural diorama for viewing polar bears, it's hard to beat Svalbard. And it's definitely a place that's on the top of my list. It is a place where polar bears are in a lot of trouble. The Barents Sea is one of the subpopulations that's losing their sea ice the quickest. Some of my colleagues have noticed rapid declines in sea ice just in the last 5 to 10 years. And they're seeing it affecting the bears very quickly. We're seeing starving bears sometimes in Svalbard that are having a harder time finding those seals. So it is a place that's changing quickly. If it's a place that's on your list to visit, now's a good time to do it because there is a lot of change happening there at a really rapid rate. All right, Western Hudson Bay is the other subpopulation that is going to be visited by a Naturalist Journeys trip. This is a place where I visited. Churchill is located in the Western Hudson Bay subpopulation of polar bears. It is kind of renowned as the polar bear capital of the world. The reason is this is a different type of kind of natural history for these polar bears. They don't have consistent sea ice throughout the year to be hunting on. So when that sea ice recedes in the summer, almost every bear in that population is going to come ashore. And they're spending that entire summer season essentially fasting and just waiting for the sea ice to refreeze in the fall to leave again. So these bears can be found on the shore, just kind of waiting for the sea ice, doing what we call walking hibernation, which is essentially they slow down, their metabolism slows down a little bit, and they're just fasting as long as they possibly can until they can get back out on the sea ice. There are some bears, and I think John might speak to this a little bit more, that have actually learned how to hunt beluga whales and are getting pretty good at that, which is a really interesting adaptation. Polar bears really can only survive on the really dense, calorie-dense marine mammal blubber. So without that blubber, they just really can't get the energy requirement they need to make it through the winter, to make it through the rest of their year. They're not like a grizzly bear or a black bear where they have this whole range of potential options to eat for food. They need something that is just absolutely packed in calories. So that's why they're going for marine mammals. So if they can't get a seal, they're going to try and get a beluga whale or something like that, and vice versa. They're just constantly looking for marine mammals. In Western Hudson Bay in the summer, this is more likely the kind of scene that you're going to have. You're going to have bears that are on the shore in the vegetation, again, waiting for that sea ice freeze up. If you get lucky, you get to see them in this beautiful fireweed that grows in Hudson Bay and Churchill. I was there in the fall right before the sea ice froze up again, so we had some really beautiful orange color to the tundral vegetation and whatnot there. So they are very visible in that part of the world because they have all congregated on shore. And it really is the best place. If you're just going, if your goal is to see a polar bear, Churchill's probably your best bet. And in the summer can be a little tricky sometimes still, but it is easier than a lot of the other places in the world. In Churchill, in the Western Hudson Bay population, there's roughly 600, 650 bears left. That's actually dropped pretty precipitously in the last couple of years even. And that is because these bears are really only able to fast for so long before it starts to really affect their body condition and their reproductive success. And unfortunately, with climate change, they are getting pushed to the brink of what they can sustain in those fasts. And where we're really seeing a big impact is in reproduction. Bears that used to have 2 or 3 cubs commonly are now having 0 to 1 cub. So it is something that's happening very quickly. It's happening right before our eyes. It's hard to be a polar bear biologist. It is. It's a hard animal to study because it's not a problem that seems easy to fix. But it is an interesting thing, and this is kind of going to be my last little part before I turn it over to John. That's a little bit more hopeful. One thing that is interesting about polar bears is there are a few subpopulations of polar bears that are so high in these Canadian archipelagos that these changing conditions of sea ice and whatnot aren't necessarily a detriment to them. If anything, they might even be opening up a little bit more potential habitat for them. So there are some subpopulations of polar bears that are going to persist through at least the end of the century, if not longer. But these two that are historically some of the more visible, they are being affected by it. And I do think that if it's on your list to see polar bears, now is the time to go see them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, and I will stick around in case there are questions for me at the end of the meeting here.
Thanks,
Okay,
Wes.
thank you. I think I'm going to be able to reclaim the host and turn it over to you, John. So just give me about 2 seconds here.
No problem. And while you're doing that, I just want to give I see a few of my friends on the attendee list too. Linda from an Antarctic trip a few years ago, and then Fred and I just lost your name. Hey, Linda.
Okay, I'm going to pop in and say thank you so much, John, for joining us as well. And I've made you the host, and I can't wait to hear you introduce yourself.
Let me start sharing here. So you guys can all see that good? Fred and
Yes,
Carl.
it looks great. We
That
got you.
Carl I was forgetting. So good. I'm glad you guys can see this. Yeah, so I'm going to take off a little bit and talk a little bit more about the specific trips for Naturalist Journeys. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of slides from the Svalbarb trip. I wound up getting sick last year just before that trip took off and was unable to do the trip. All of my other polar bear pictures, Arctic pictures are before I had digital cameras, and I have a bunch of slides, but I have not got them scanned. So I'm going to focus a lot of my initial talk here on the Churchill part. But before I do that, I am going to introduce myself. My name is John Carlson. I have a kind of a split job. I work for Naturalist Journeys as a guide. I tell my son it's kind of like a superhero thing. I do the other part of my life is working in this guiding, but the main job that I do, my day job, is I'm the Regional Grassland Conservation Coordinator for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I am very thankful for my supervisors there allowing me to take the time off to go and share some of these wonderful places at both ends of the world. And tonight I'm going to talk about our trip to Churchill primarily last year and kind of walk through what that trip looked like for us. I will talk a little bit about the Svalbard trip just in general, but I don't have any pictures to go along with that. So we'll just get into our journey to Churchill here. So we build this trip as birds, bears, and belugas. And so I can guarantee you will see 2 out of those 3. And those would be the birds and the belugas. The bears, I can't guarantee, but we had really good luck last year. I'm going to back up to this slide. This was a bear. As Wes mentioned, we had these, all the belugas come here to feed on the capelin that are spawning at the mouth of the Churchill River. And they were everywhere. When we first arrived there, you looked out over the mouth of the Churchill River, and there were belugas surfacing pretty much every direction you looked in the water. This particular bear we found a few days into our trip. We had gone across the mouth of the Churchill River to the fort that's on the point there, walked up into the fort and onto the ramparts, and Woody Wheeler, the guide emeritus from Naturalist Journeys, was standing next to me, and we walked up to the edge and looked over, and Woody goes, "Oh, there's a bear." And sure enough, he was sitting out here on the rocks. He's turned around and started walking towards us, and our local guide got us out of the fort really quick and back into our Zodiacs and on the water. And we went around to see what he was doing, and it turns out he had actually captured a beluga in the water in the mouth of the Churchill River. I don't know how he did that, because there's ocean going ships that are coming in and out of that mouth of the Churchill River. So it's not like they caught this whale in the shallows. He somehow caught it in that deeper water, whether or not he pinned it up against the shore, or I don't know. But it was really interesting to watch him maneuvering that beluga and feeding around in the shallows there. And again, the beluga whales, there are thousands of them there at the mouth of the Churchill River feeding on these capelin, which are a small fish. And I guess we could add another tagline to this: birds, bears, belugas, and butterflies. This is an Arctic blue sitting on a rock. And I'm just going to kind of scroll through some of the photos I took last year, give you an idea of what the trip looks like. We did find some flowers too. That's one of the really nice things about being able to wander around in this kind of southerly distribution of polar bears right on the edge of the boreal forest. This is a Arctic raspberry, and we made a trip into the boreal forest south of Churchill one day. Flying into Churchill is pretty spectacular in itself. You're flying over this kind of untracked tundra, and this is just sticking my iPhone up against the window of the plane, and it was just amazing country to see from the air. There was no tracks. There's one railroad track heading up to Churchill, and occasionally that would be in view, but otherwise it was just this unbroken muskeg tundra. It was absolutely gorgeous, and I really thought it would be nice to explore that area. But we arrived at Churchill. We stay at the Lazy Bear Lodge, which is a really nice facility. It's got a dining room in there. The rooms were very nice. And they're kind of our host entity for the trip to Churchill. This is our counterpart to the Svalbard trip, which will be on a ship. This is, in a sense, our ship when we're at Churchill. This is my group from last year. We're standing out on Cape Mary. This was the day that we arrived in Churchill. It was, you can see the ice in the background. Last year was as Wes said, the longer term trend is towards a lot less ice. We happened to get there last year in a year that had pretty good ice conditions. The wind was blowing off of Hudson Bay from the north. And at the time, we were all kind of complaining it was a little bit chilly coming from the United States in the middle of July, and you've got cold wind blowing off the Hudson Bay ice. But we did find out that that was actually a bit of a blessing, because it did keep the mosquitoes down a little bit. And that's one thing with Churchill, is there are mosquitoes in Churchill. And so that'll be an issue to deal with, but I think everybody had a good time despite the mosquitoes. So we learned to appreciate the cold wind a lot more. So right away, we start seeing shorebirds. This is a whimbrel. And the really neat part about this trip for me this year was I wound up heading south in November to Antarctica, and we had an extension into Tierra del Fuego. And I saw many of the bird species that I had got to observe in Churchill on their wintering grounds in South America. So kind of completing both ends of their life cycle and following them with my travels was pretty special. But there were whimbrels were pretty common, breeding along the edge of Hudson Bay there. White-winged scoters, and we got an Arctic tern here, and then a common goldeneye. This is a day we are out on Hudson Bay in a boat that's run by the Lazy Bear Lodge. They actually have a new boat that we'll be using this year. It's a catamaran that has a viewing window under the water. This is the way the owner was describing it to me. In the other boats, you're stuck looking at belugas from up above. So you see them surface, and belugas aren't big on bringing their tail out of the water or any of that sort of stuff. They spend most of their time under the water. But this will allow us to actually get to below the water without actually getting in the water and see the belugas from underneath. And the other really neat part about this day was the Fata Morgana on the horizon, the illusions of land up above as the light was bending through the cold and warm air above the bay. And this was our trip. We went over towards Seal River to find our first group of polar bears. I think it turned out there were 7 bears in this group, and they were feeding on a beluga whale that presumably they had trapped in. Hudson Bay has an extremely large tidal range. And so as the tide goes out on Hudson Bay, the water is very shallow and exposes a lot of shoreline. And the prevailing theory was that these bears had caught this beluga in some of the shallow water and killed it, and then brought it closer to shore. You can see there, it was kind of fun. There were bears popping out of the willows. We had another one over here, and at one point there was a cub that came he didn't want to get too close to any of the bigger bears here, but he kind of darted through the opening. And then a little bit later, we actually had a wolf come out and check out this beluga kill and wander around the bears a little bit. The owner of the Lazy Bear said that was something he didn't see very often. So we felt very fortunate to be able to see that many bears in one spot and have the wolf come out and make an appearance as well. This was the group last year. You can see Churchill in the background here. It's a shipping port, was built to export grain. It was a much closer way to get grain on ships. So it's a deep water port. We use the Zodiac, much like we use in the Svalbard trip and our Antarctic trips, very versatile vehicles to get us out and around. And we use that to get out just on the Churchill River and watch belugas. And I don't have a picture of the main boat. And again, we'll be using a different one this coming summer, but you get your Mustang suit on and get all dressed up and warm to go out on Hudson Bay. I recognize that person on my screen. This is us standing on the shore of Hudson Bay during one of our excursions out looking for birds. This is a really nice little shorebird spot. And again, you can see there's some mosquito nets here. Mosquito repellent scarf that seemed to function fairly well. I believe here we were looking at semi-palmated plovers along the shore that breed on the edge of Hudson Bay. This was another one of those birds. These are Hudsonian godwits. This is a small group that we saw. And again, this was another bird that I got to see on the wintering ground later in the fall. So pretty special observation for me. I don't get to see Hudsonian godwits here in the central part of the continent very much. Savannah sparrows were pretty common. This was taken right behind our hotel. And then on the last day, we went out in one of their, what are called tundra buggies. And it's their fall viewing vehicles. As Wes said, in the fall, there's a lot more bears around, but you completely lose the birds and the belugas. It's certain to see bears then, but the bird life shifts quite dramatically that late in the fall. But they did take us out for a day to tour around in the tundra buggies in a place along the shore. And we got to see this tundra swan, a pair of tundra swans actually, in one of the meltwater ponds along the way. And then this is the observation again from Cape Mary, which is the tip of land that sticks out at the mouth of the Hudson Bay at the town of Churchill. And this was an evening trip that some of us did to watch the sun go down with one of our local guides, and did a little bit of birding again back out on Cape Mary. And that's my wrap up of the Churchill trip. And then this is actually a slide or a picture that I took this November in Antarctica of the sister ship of the one we were on. This is the Plancius. This is an ocean-wide vessel that we will be on for our Svalbard trip this coming summer. I sailed on the Plancius. That was my first trip with Oceanwide. When I worked for Oceanwide, it's a smaller ship. It's not as big as the Hondius that we were on in our Antarctic journey this year, but very intimate. And I really enjoy being on this ship. It's a bit smaller. It's a converted research vessel, so it doesn't have a lot of the bells and whistles that the larger purpose-built Hondius does, but it's an amazing little vessel for getting in and around the ice. And that's the difference for the Svalbard trip, is that rather than going to where the bears, or having the bears kind of come to Churchill to observe them, that we do on our Churchill trip with that short little excursion out into Hudson Bay to try and find them along the edge of the shore. The Svalbard trip makes a lot of stops along the land or at the edge of Svalbard, but there's a number of forays out into the sea ice to actually go looking for the polar bears where they live. And in general, a day-to-day operation on this trip would go to a particular location. We would do a landing on shore. We'd get in to see the Zodiacs here piled on the back deck. I had that picture earlier of us boarding the Zodiacs when we were in Churchill. Amazing little vessels for getting in and around the ice and off the ship. We'd take an excursion to shore, come back to the ship, and then move over lunch to another place, kind of repeat that over again until we head back out into the pack ice. And then we would spend a bulk of the time, in the pack ice, actually looking for polar bears out in that environment as Wes described. So that's about all I have from my side tonight. And I'm really looking forward to some questions here, if anybody has any. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so we can.
Okay, it would be super if anybody has questions, if you could type them into the chat box. Both of these trips look really fantastic, and John, you did great, and so did you, Wes. Thanks for doing it.
Yeah, thanks, Wes. I really appreciate that.
No problem. Yep, I love talking about polar bears. So truly, anytime.
I know
We got one
feeling.
question here. What other species would you see in Svalbard?
Hi, Linda. Boy, there's caribou on land. There's a whole suite of birds. The other really bird that I'm excited to see on this trip is the ivory gull, high Arctic, pure white gull. There are a bunch of seabirds, and it is high Arctic. Svalbard's a ways up there, so it does tend to limit the variety of bird species in particular. But as Wes said, bearded seals, ring seals, potential for bowhead whales, no bowhead, right whales. Is that right? One of those two. Potential for beluga whales there.
Walrus.
Yes, thank you. Lots of walrus. Purple sandpipers is one of the other big birds. Skuas, red phalaropes, glaucous gulls. Yeah.
Svalbard has I think there's a native reindeer species too that's like only found in Svalbard that they're much smaller and kind of a cute little reindeer.
Yeah, they are little diminutive things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect for pulling a sleigh.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. We have another question
For
here.
big bearded guy.
Yes. Why are the bears not aggressive to one another?
Wes?
You know, they can be for sure, especially if it's like a big male bear that's trying to assert dominance or remove future competition, or a female that's protecting her cubs from other bears. In Churchill, especially, a lot of times you'll see sparring, which isn't really aggression. It's more along the lines of play. Whereas those bears are waiting for the sea ice to refreeze, they're kind of just honing their skills, sparring between each other, and it is kind of been equated to play behavior. As far as aggression goes in Churchill, it doesn't happen a lot because they are doing their utmost to preserve their energy. Again, it's that fasting period. They are trying their hardest not to expend any excess calories or burn excess calories. So they really don't want to fight if they don't have to. So it's not common to see. And then in Svalbard, the bears are so spread out while they're out on that pack ice looking for seals, looking for prey, that they really don't cross paths that often. Really, the only time it ever happens is a female defending her cubs, and in both those ecosystems, it's not a really common occurrence.
Okay, a couple more questions here. How big is a beluga whale? And I'm assuming I'd like to know in comparison to a polar bear.
Oh shoot, I didn't have that picture in there. So belugas are what, 10, 12 feet long, I suppose. Maybe twice the weight of, well, Wes, I don't know. A large polar bear would probably be similar in size, right? But
yeah, weight-wise, I would say the edge goes to the beluga still, but I've seen some crazy videos with polar bears. They'll like, there's these things called polynya out on the sea ice, which is essentially a hole that forms that never freezes over. I'm sure there's a good explanation from that. But sometimes belugas or narwhals or other marine mammals will congregate in those polynya because or like a lead in the sea ice or these other places where they have access to oxygen. And a bear will figure that out, and they will, like, you'll see a big male polar bear literally pull a full-size beluga whale on its own out of the water and onto the ice, which is just insane when you think about it, the leverage that you would have to do that. And it just speaks to how powerful a polar bear actually is. They're incredibly powerful animals to be able to do something like that. And speaking a little bit more about the Churchill thing, there's a really interesting segment from maybe Planet Earth or Frozen Earth or one of those BBC blue chip documentaries where they found some polar bears that had specialized in waiting on rocks in the mouth of the river there. And they would wait for the belugas come in and out with the tide. John was describing it's such an interesting tidal ecosystem. And this bear had figured out that the belugas were coming back and forth, and it sat and waited on this rock and just waited for the perfect beluga to come by and would literally like pounce on top of it, kill it, and pull it out of the water. And they're just, I mean, they're really smart animals. They're good at problem solving and figuring those kind of things out. So cross your fingers if you go on that Churchill trip, you get to see something like that.
Smart and unbelievably powerful.
Totally.
A couple more questions. We've got, do polar bears ever eat any plants at all?
Yeah, I can fill that one really quick. You know, in Churchill especially, you will see them eating grass and some of that coastal vegetation sometimes. It's not for a nutritional thing. It's more just to keep their digestive system active as they're going through that fast. So they will eat plants, but it's really just to exercise their digestive system.
Okay, I have a question, which is actually my own question. So I was writing a polar bear facts list, and one of the things I read was that polar bears will frequently clean the blood off of themselves while they're eating. And do you know why that is?
I can't say for sure, but I have heard that a few times. The kind of the main prevailing theory that I've heard is just because they're a white animal on a white habitat, and they sometimes employ stealth hunting tactics, that they want to maintain as white of a coat as possible because it does provide some natural camouflage. And if it's a bright red bear, it does tend to stand out. So that's the main theory I've heard behind that. I don't know if John has anything else he's heard about that particular behavior.
No, the only other thing I can imagine is I wouldn't want to wear my food around on my face all day either. So it just could be kind of a personal hygiene thing as well.
Yeah, I was also wondering because they have the transparent fur and their skin is black because they're trying to absorb rays from the sun. And I was wondering if the blood might keep the sun from getting through to that. But in any case, I'll move on to guest questions instead of my own question. All right. Next up, we have, let's see. I've read that or heard that polar bears are being observed further south looking for food sources they're not used to eating because of climate change. Is that true? And if so, what has been observed?
Yeah, that has happened. We've seen polar bears in places where historically they haven't really shown up. There was a really famous example of that where one showed up on a highway somewhere in Ontario, I believe, recently. That was just kind of way out of their typical habitat. You're with these kind of massive ecological changes, we're not giving the animals the time they need to evolve new behavior. So you are going to have individuals that create these adaptations where it decides, okay, I figured out there's a dump nearby that I can use for food. And a single bear will figure that out, and it maybe is going to be enough to help that bear survive. But as a population, it's not enough for them. And there's no, as I mentioned earlier, there's no food source for polar bears that gives them the kind of calorie kind of requirement that they need to survive outside of marine mammals. That's really it for them. Unless we were to feed them, Twinkies or whatever we have that has that same kind of calorie ratio. They don't have that in nature outside of marine mammals. And that bear already exists. Like the bear that's already looking for sedge grasses and everything else that is lower calorie, that's a grizzly bear. And that's what polar bears evolved from. So if they were to go through that,
isn't fun, but
if they were to go through that evolution,
but I told him, I
turn them
says,
back into a grizzly bear. I
oh
think we got
yeah, it
someone.
was the real
Just a
thing.
moment. I'm going to grab a hold of the host duties and fix that.
In fact, when he first took it off, he
I think I
says,
can
these
do
are
it
never
too.
a problem. Don't worry about
Let's see here.
it. And
Okay, that's done. All right. So let's see. Can you talk a little bit, John, about the birding component in Churchill? Because I think, isn't there some boreal birding that's done? Maybe you already discussed it at length, but I was just curious. Is it a birdier trip than the Norway trip?
A little bit, I would say. There's a little bit more diversity in the Churchill trip just because it's that much farther south. And we do have an opportunity one of the days to do some birding around Churchill. Still working kind of what that might look like specifically. Last year we ventured down into the boreal forest. One of the big things I was looking for, a lot of us were looking for, were ptarmigan, which are fairly common around Churchill, but we had a hard time finding one. We finally did find one. And then along the Churchill River, there's a wide variety of gulls right there. There's the big seaport with lots of grain terminals. There's some really great birding places right in town that you can walk to. So yeah, it's right on that edge, and you have to work a little bit to get into the trees. And like I said, I'm trying to figure out exactly what that might look like for this coming year, which direction we might go. Pine grosbeaks, I think the cavity nesters are a little bit tougher to find because the trees there are not very big around. So there's not a lot of good sized cavities. They do have some boreal owls around, but those have mostly been where they put up nest boxes for those birds. So yeah,
Okay,
good shorebirds.
good. Thank you. Looks like there's a question here for you, Jesse. Does Svalbard require anything more than a passport for entry? It's part of Norway, correct? Which I think it is for sure.
I'm going to have to look at our general information, but John probably knows because he just did that. So I'll let John answer.
No, I didn't quite get that far, Jesse. I was homesick for that.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
But I was all ready to go, and all I needed was my passport, Linda.
I think we do fly into Norway, so I think pretty
Yes.
sure the answer is yes on that. But
John, really quickly, just if there's anything, is there anything you can think of for those trips that people should know that they might not expect?
Good question.
Especially being on a ship.
So this is kind of an odd thing, but it always seems to get people on board the ship. There's no sized cloth that's a washcloth. You've got big towels and little towels. So I always tell people on my Antarctic trips, and it's even in the hotels in Argentina, washcloths are pretty valuable. So you might want to bring your own. That's kind of a really odd little tip. I mentioned earlier the bugs in Churchill. They are and can be. I think last year was a bit of a really good bug year for Churchill. But I brought bug nets for everybody, and you just learn to put your bug net on or deal with swatting mosquitoes and flies. I can't think of anything else.
How would you describe the pace?
The pace, pretty relaxed. In the Churchill trip, because we're based out of the hotel, the lazy bear kind of our trip out onto Hudson Bay is dictated by the tides. And so that one will float around a little bit, tide and weather, obviously, as to when we can do that. There are options to do some sea kayaking. And so like last year, some of the group went out on a sea kayaking trip. The rest of us walked around town looking for birds that day. I think we had a few hours, a couple times there where just you were free to wander around Churchill and see what was going on in Churchill. And then the day trips, it's pretty relaxed. I generally lead trips to the pace of the people that are with me. And if I've got a group of people that are really interested in finding as many birds as they can, we'll pick up the pace. But mostly what I found with Naturalist Journeys, folks, is we want to see a lot of birds, but we also want to have a good time doing it. And mealtime is always a really good kind of relaxing time to visit. And the Lazy Bear Lodge has a really nice restaurant, like I said. So for me as a guide, I always try to pace that to the folks that I have with me and make it fun. It's their trip.
We have a follow-up question and another question. I'm going to stick with the follow-up question right now, and then we'll go back to the other one. This is a question. So you do bring bug nets, question mark. What's the average temperature? What kind of boots?
So let me see here. So Churchill was probably, it was warm. Actually, it was surprisingly warm for me. I was looking to get out of the hot temperatures in Montana in July and have some nice cool weather in Churchill. And it was other than the day that we were out on the water, I was surprised at how warm it was. I want to say it was high 60s, 70s, maybe even an 80 in that week, which speaks to the stuff that Wes was talking about earlier about changing climate in that part of the world. When we went out on the boat, we actually had boots that they provided for us. And then all the gear that you saw, the Mustang suit and that sort of stuff. So you got to wear that while you were out on the boat, but otherwise it was just hiking boots. On the ship for the Svalbard trip, Ocean Wide provides muck boots. And so you don't have to worry about bringing any sort of specialized gear other than some hiking boots for when we do shore excursions. But getting in and out of the Zodiac, you're going to get your feet wet anyway. So most of the time, based on my Antarctic trips, I leave my muck boots on. They're comfortable enough to walk the distances that you generally wind up walking in Svalbard without being uncomfortable. And it allows you that you don't have to worry about changing boots. And there's biosecurity concerns then. If you bring your own boots, you have to clean them very well, because the last thing we want to do is start introducing seeds and foreign material from other places around the world into these rather pristine Arctic landscapes and Antarctic landscapes. So I recommend bringing, like when you're on the ship, just some comfortable shoes around the ship. I had a pair of tennis shoes, and then wearing the muck boots when you're doing shore excursions.
Okay, we have now a bear question, and so maybe this is a Wes question. Have the grizzly bears interbred with the polar bears?
Thanks for the question, Eric. Good to see you guys on here. But Eric joined us in the Brazilian Pantanal last year, became a friend. Grizzly. Polar and grizzly bears have hybridized. They typically call the resulting offspring either a growler bear or a pizzly bear. I think those names kind of depend on the sex of the bear, but it's really rare. It doesn't happen that often. It does seem to be slightly increasing in frequency just because grizzlies are tending to go a little bit further north as that habitat opens up to them a little more, and polar bears are tending to spend a little bit more time on shore. So especially in northern Alaska and northern Canada, we've seen those hybridization events a bit more. One really interesting fact about Churchill in particular, it's the only place in North America where you have a chance of seeing all three North American bears. So Churchill is habitat for polar bears specifically, but there are grizzly bears that inhabit the area as well as North American black bears. So it is the only place on Earth where you have that opportunity to possibly see all three.
So you never know whether you're supposed to lay down, run away. It's very confusing, is what you're saying.
Yeah, you're supposed to stay behind your guide and make sure that they're well prepared for it.
Never getting the problem in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I've got no more questions, so I want to ask just kind of a fun one. So if you had two 1,700-pound bears, one grizzly bear and one polar bear, which one would win?
The grizzly bear, most likely. That circumstance is happening. It's playing out on these whale carcasses that I brought up earlier, in northern Alaska, especially communities like Kaktovik and Barrow. They harvest bowhead whales, and then the bears come in and feed on the carcasses, and you're seeing grizzly bears and polar bears come in. And the grizzly bears more often than not, will run the polar bears off of those carcasses, even when they're much smaller than the polar bears. So it's just a more aggressive animal. It's a more territorial animal. If you put them in a cage and they had to fight to the death, I don't know which one is coming out of that, the victor. But as far as the aggression level, grizzlies are more aggressive and they do tend to display that more often. So a polar bear will generally run away from a grizzly.
Is it
Not
because
always,
polar bears don't normally run into problems with other animals except other polar bears? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that might be part of it, that they just really don't have a need to defend and the same level that grizzly bears do. But every animal kind of has that fight or flight, and for whatever reason, grizzly bears are a fight animal. There's a polar bear biologist that I've worked with closely who's done work with both, and he said, every time you're chasing a polar bear to like if they're collaring or doing whatever in a helicopter, the bear will run. But if he's had multiple times where he's done the same with grizzly bears, where the grizzly will simply sit down and wait for the helicopter to land because it just is done with it and it's pissed off and it's just like, fine, I'm going to let this helicopter land so I can attack it. And you don't see that with polar bears. So they are just a very different animal.
One final question. We've had another one pop up. Are there no seals in the Churchill area for polar bears to eat?
I think, go ahead.
Cindy Welch.
Oh, hey. Yes. So I think both of us can probably speak to that, but there are definitely seals in that area. That's their main meal deal again, but those seals are out in the water, and without the sea ice, the bears don't have a platform for hunting. They aren't athletic enough in the water to swim and chase down a seal. So they have to use that ice to stalk and hunt, or the breathing holes or the dens or the different ways that I brought up earlier. So while that ice isn't there, they just simply aren't able to catch those seals. John, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think it's primarily ring seals in Hudson Bay, right?
Yeah.
Jesse, if people have more questions after the Zoom, can they email you, or should they email travel@Naturalist Journeys?
Email travel@Naturalist Journeys. That's me. And we'd be happy to help you.
Okay, looks like there is one more question. Sorry. There are lots of trips to both of these locations. Do you avoid encountering other tour groups on these trips?
John?
The quick answer is yes. But in the town of Churchill, we're generally a part of the group that's staying at the Lazy Bear during that week. So our Naturalist Journeys would be a subgroup of all of the people that are staying at the hotel and doing similar activities. So that's built into part of the operations, is that there's only, like when we went out on Hudson Bay, it was a sub part of the group, so we weren't running into another boat. From the shipboard side on Svalbard, much like Antarctica, I think there's a cooperation among the tour companies to avoid being at the same place at the same time. So you may see another ship, but you're never at the same landing at the same time.
Okay, I think we're at the end of the questions. And so I just want to say thank you to both of our presenters, to Jesse, and to everyone for attending. And look forward to seeing you on another Zoom, and hopefully on a trip soon with Naturalist Journeys.
Great. Thanks, everybody.